Welcome back. Today we are talking about cyber exercises with Fiona Raymond-Cox. Fiona, great first segment there. And as we alluded to it a couple of times, we're going to talk now about tabletops and crisis management team participation. And you kind of hinted at it once. There's a lot of focus now of the crisis management team and crisis management and communications being involved with tabletop exercises. Why is that now? Why is that seem to be so much more involvement than in previous years?
I think people are realizing that the nature of a cyber incident requires a broad response in a way that many other disasters or disruptions to the business have not. And therefore, no one team can respond. It needs IT, you need to have the IT folks in the room, the InfoSec teams, crisis management, crisis communications, as well as the business. And so I think what's happening is that the scope of these serious incidents requires a really well-coordinated response across the entire company. These incidents are, as somebody said, bigger than a bread box.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've structured your crisis management team properly, then what happens is you have one cross-functional decision-making body that takes, control during a response to a disruption. It truly is the team that takes command and control of the situation. And I always feel that the crisis management team is like the glue that brings these cross-functional teams together to enable decision making. I think hitherto the crisis management team and IT and business, they didn't really play very well together. And so few companies actually tested the response protocols end to end. But I think that's really become critical these days.
Well, how do you make a tabletop exercise engaging for crisis management team members, considering quite often they're pretty high up in the organization and have other things they want to focus on? So how do you get them engaged so they really understand why they're doing it and what their role is in the event of a cyber incident?
Well, okay, so I'm going to start by just saying, frankly, a crisis management team member should be high up in the organization. They're the ones that the employees will really look to for guidance on how to respond. So they've got to be well respected. And so I just have to say, putting somebody else in that role doesn't really make sense. So I think the key is getting them involved. You have to give them something to chew on. So the key, so what I mean by that is, something that if they didn't, without their input, the response would impede the response of the company. But they're needed. And so the way we do that is to work with a design team that's sworn to secrecy and to create as realistic a scenario as possible. Because what we don't want is, in an exercise, a member of the CMT saying, "Oh, this would never happen." We sometimes get that, even with a design team, but the more that we can make that have a sort of personal impact to the member of that team, I think the better engaged that person will be. So you've got to make sure that you have to give them specific actions to perform, and also think about decisions that are going to require their input, because that's going to engage them. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And it leads me to my next one. Mm-hmm. If you've got a crisis management team and you've got the high level personnel, the vice presidents and the C-suite, etc., with the various testing that goes on, how do you bring them all together? And by that, I mean, not just cyber, but there will be tabletops for a business continuity plan. And we talked about this actually before we started recording today, where I've been in incidents where tabletop exercises are being done with various groups, and yet none of them are talking with each other. So how do you go about now bringing them all together, including the crisis management team? Because sometimes what one team is talking about, let's say the business continuity group, well, I'll just pull that one out. No reason, so no one sent an email. Business continuity is doing their thing. Crisis management's doing theirs. ITDRP is doing theirs. Cyber comes along and doesn't talk to either one of them, just wants to talk to the executive. So how do you bring all these different testing and groups together with a single focus so they work together and understand how they need to work together?
Well, I think you have to start by training, educating the crisis management team on their roles and responsibilities. So I'm going to give you another example. If the crisis management team isn't well versed in how to respond themselves, then they're going to lose credibility if you try to exercise with other teams. You know, and we've been helping companies overcome this over and over again. I learned that the hard way once when the client really wanted us to exercise. They were on a really tight time schedule and they had to get an exercise done, and they had formed their crisis management team, and we had all the business departments and they all had their plans, and we had the teams in two separate rooms. And the crisis management team, it was the first time that they were actually rehearsing their roles and understanding how they should perform, because it takes them out of their day-to-day comfort zone often. And so you want people to be very aware of the protocols that they have to think about before you engage another part of the business. And then you had in the other room, 60 people sort of, basically knocking on the door saying, come on, I need, what decisions are you making? So that's something I think is really an important part of the evolution of building these skill sets on all sorts of levels. So it's probably good to maybe exercise the different teams individually. And then as your program matures, you bring in these teams to respond properly. And I think what you really want to do is if you're at that point where you've educated everybody and they're feeling comfortable, then I think the next step is to have a scenario that impacts multiple business areas, and different types of teams and the resources that they need. So, I think whilst a cyber exercise, because that's the focus of today's discussion, is really around technology, it's very likely it's going to impact the employees. It could impact resources. It might take out the building management system, for example, as well. So you can start bringing in these other teams and having IT and the InfoSec team there. But I think you really want to make sure the crisis management team is well versed in what they have to do, and that other teams know their roles. And then you would hope that you follow crisis management team. Well, actually, your business continuity management programs, response protocols, so that communication up and down the daisy chain, I think, is really key.
So you kind of start off small, understand, and using cyber as our topic today, understanding what these, on an individual level, what these departments are expecting when it comes to a cyber response, what they need or what their questions are. Because then the next time you bring maybe two groups together, there's a stronger understanding. They're aware of where the other one is coming from. And then crisis management knows, if I'm understanding you correctly, will understand what information they need to provide. They will understand what decisions they need to make and the ones they could pass off to others. Someone
Yeah,
needs a laptop. Well, give that to somebody else, that kind of thing. So you build up all those capabilities, right?
yeah, I think you can I don't think you necessarily have to be going back to the crisis management team saying, this particular team wants an answer to X before you exercise. I think it's more
Hmm.
around protocols.
Right.
For a crisis management team, given what you know at this point, are you going to activate? Making that decision, determining, having an agenda to follow and knowing how to follow it and record decisions and determine actions. All of that is process. And I think that that's, if you haven't got that fairly well understood, it's going to be very hard for the crisis management team to, as I say, really look effective in front of everybody
Right.
else. And as it's a senior group of people, you want to make sure that they are effective.
Yeah, and they want to make sure they're effective.
And they do.
Yeah.
They absolutely do. And, so sometimes we have situations where they, crisis management team say, well, okay, we could do better in this next time. Let's do another exercise before we
Yeah.
work with another team. So it depends on the organization. I'm just trying to I really want to make sure that people are set up for success. I think that's
Right.
the key. And, the reality is that the best designed exercise will mimic how the response should play out.
Right.
It's
And where I was
as
going,
realistic as possible.
yeah, exactly. Oh yeah. Make them, how do, your friend Regina, what does she say? Make them cry?
Make them cry. Yes, yes, yes. She is my friend, and she does want to make them cry. But I mean, that's the reality. I think going back to your question is that how do you engage, the crisis management team, or anyone that's exercising, give them something to do. There's nothing worse than an executive or anybody really sitting there twiddling their thumbs saying, why am I in the room?
Right.
Make sure that you give everybody, they have a role to play. It may not be immediate. It may be that you bring them in later into the exercise, depending on the duration, or you may have them sit out to one side because they're not needed, and that when they're needed, they're called to the table, so to speak.
Yeah, I've seen that happen. There was a lot of times in a lot of organizations, communications is within the marketing department. But some of the people that were putting this test together thought, oh, it's marketing. So no, we're not going to do promotions and things like that. That'll all stop. So they started to go through their tabletop test, and people were saying, shouldn't we be communicating something? Nothing's gone out yet. And then someone said, well, that's because you told the marketing team they weren't involved. So they're not here. There's no communication.
I know we have this all the time. Don't even get me started on that one. So, getting people to perform specific actions, pushing them to make decisions that require their input, I think is all the sorts of things that you do to engage people is my thoughts.
We have 1 minute left for this segment. Any final thought on the crisis management team and cyber exercises before we move to our next segment?
I think the key is to don't be put off by the concept of running an exercise. I think it's you won't have all the answers. That's absolutely fine. But don't necessarily just do one exercise. A cyber exercise can take many forms. And I think that I think getting people into that mindset of really challenging and making them ever more complicated is probably a good lead in now to the next segment that we're going to talk about.
Well, then, based on that, we've come to the end of our second segment. We are talking about cyber exercises with Fiona Raymond-Cox, and we will be right back. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. but leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.